All right, so continuing on past the choir. The next thing is the apse. And the apse is generally at either one at the other end of the crossing, okay, or if there is a choir in the church, it's at the other end of the church. The apse should not be confused with the aisle that runs around it, okay? Oftentimes, if it was a pilgrimage church and there were chapels or places where they kept relics, there was also a walkway around the end of the apse. The apse can also be considered the entire form of the rounded end, or it can be these small forms on the side, okay, that are attached to the bigger form on the end. Those are called apsidal forms. The apse can be either round or it can be hexagonal or partial hexagonal. All right, so it doesn't necessarily always have to be round. So talking about that additional walkway that goes around the end of the apse, it's called the ambulatory. Okay, and it was used to separate a walkway that could lead to the side chapels or the side nooks on the edges from where the priest might have things that they needed for the ceremony or the liturgy that they were performing. Okay, another element that churches sometimes had was this thing called a gallery. And the gallery existed above the side aisles. So typically, the only people that had access to the gallery area were the priests or the monks. All right, but that area would be directly above where the side aisles were, and they may not run all the way around the cathedral or around the church. So I mentioned to you guys that I had a sectional drawing, and it becomes important that you guys are able to kind of identify the various components in a section of a cathedral. And so we have the two side aisles adjacent to that large space in the middle called the nave, right? And if you look up here, you'll notice that the idea is that the nave gets raised above all of the enclosed areas so that it has space that we can open up for windows. Okay? That was the idea of making the nave taller and taller and taller, was to give it an outside wall that could be used to sort of allow light into the center of the space. That area that's brought up above the enclosed portions of the structure is called the clerestory. Okay? The aisles often are separated from the nave by use of an arcade. Another element that we'll find in Romanesque churches is called a baptistry. Okay? Sometimes the baptistry would exist in one of the side sort of transepts, or in a chapel that's directly linked to the main structure. And other times, as in the case of this structure that you're looking at right here, it was a completely separate building. It was where the priests would perform baptisms. Okay? During the time that we looked at Roman architecture, we looked at the idea of a barrel vault. Okay? And so a barrel vault is also called a tunnel vault, and it's essentially an arch that's been stretched out. It uses the same sort of compressive transfer technique of taking the weight from above, right, and taking it down to the floor. The one thing that's unique about vaults is that they actually form an entire ceiling, whereas the arch is relatively thin, right, and in some cases you might have arches and then another arch further along and a wood roof between the two. In the case of vaults, the entire roof is made out of masonry. Okay. Another thing that's important to kind of understand about this period of architecture is this notion of it being modular. And so the module would create inside of the space what is called a bay. And sometimes there were bays and sub-bays. So in this particular case, the bay exists from column or pier. Okay, this is not a column actually, this is a pier. That's a column, right? From pier to pier, and it supports the vaulted roof that's above it. So this entire thing is one bay, this is another bay, and this is the third bay. Okay? An element that you're going to see on many of the sort of later Romanesque buildings are these things called blind arcades. Typically an arcade was used in a setting where either you needed windows and therefore you were doing the arches and the columns to provide a space for windows in between, or you needed to be able to walk through that space. But in the time period of the Romanesque, the arcade gets kind of transmuted or transferred or metamorphosed into a decorative element. And this is why I said that the earlier buildings were more austere, later buildings might have more decorative elements, and this is one of the things that you might find on the outside of a building as a decorative element. Similar to the notion of a blind arcade is the idea of a blind arch. And that is an arch that is put there for decorative purposes, right, but doesn't really have an opening. We talked about the idea of buttresses, okay? And if we look at this image that's up on the screen right here, we have human figures right here that are kind of giving us a scale of just how tall this thing is, right? The enclosed part of the building ends right here. All of this from here up is exposed on the outside. And so as that gets taller and is made out of masonry, right, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to think, hey, I've just stacked a bunch of bricks on top of each other and glued them together. If some strong wind or an earthquake comes along, it'll push all those things over from here up. And I'm sure that they had catastrophic failures like that. And so the idea was that there's these big, heavy walls called buttresses that are built to either side periodically along, probably in line with the bays, okay, that help to keep it from falling over. It's something along the lines of if you were going to block somebody, you might put your back leg out and kind of lean forward. It's doing that same thing, but from a structural perspective. And then one other thing that we'll see kind of develop, we'll see it more as we move into the Gothic period, is the idea of a flying buttress. And that's where there's not just a heavy wall built to lean against the building, but there are these elements that go from the heavy buttress over and push against that. It would be something on the order of me kind of leaning against this. Okay? It's one thing for me to put my entire body against the wall and hold it back. And it's quite another for me to stand out here and push with my arm. And so that's essentially how the flying buttress sort of works. One of the things that the Romans developed, and they used to some extent, and then they stopped using it, was this idea of a groin vault. All right? So you guys know what a barrel vault is, right? If you design it correctly, a barrel vault can intersect another barrel vault, and that creates what is referred to as a groin vault. Groin vaults rely on fairly heavy masonry. Okay? So they're essentially functioning the same way as an arch. Later on, as we start to move through the Romanesque, you're going to find that there are ribbed vaults, which use a much thinner shell. Okay? And there are diagonal ribs that go between them. So we have the main rib that would land on the piers. That creates a bay, and the next, so the bay goes from there to there. But in between that is where two sort of groin elements would meet. So this is raised here and raised here. So it's like a groin vault, but it's using these ribs at the corner points to essentially take the loads so that the shell can be much thinner. So in contrast to that, we have this thing called the transverse arch, which is a much simpler system. You can see that in this system, it's just a tunnel vault going one direction. With the groins and with the ribbed vaults, it's not just going one direction, it goes both directions. So every single one of the bays you'll see has a vault going east to west and another vault running north to south, and each bay is separated by those ribs. In this particular case, the bays are separated by the transverse arch. In some churches or some cathedrals, you'll see something called the chancel arch. It sits on the other side of the transept, and the chancel arch is essentially a big, heavy arch that separates out the apse from the rest of the structure. I mentioned to you when we were talking about ambulatories, choirs, that those areas would often be screened off, and the screening was in the form of a wooden screen. Sometimes the wooden screens would exist between the piers, and other times they would actually section off entire portions of the nave, for example, where the choir was. In this particular case, this is a choir screen. It's sitting at the other end of the crossing, okay, and sectioning off where those private sections where only the priests would go to retrieve the things that they needed for the liturgy. The clerestory window we already talked about, but I just wanted to make sure that we kind of look at it from like an interior perspective. So in a case like this, we might have the ceiling coming up, or the roof of the aisles coming up to somewhere in here. And this is where we would stretch the nave up so that we could open up portions. Now this, what you're looking at here, is really Gothic, but clerestories exist both in Gothic and in Romanesque buildings. All right, we talked about abbeys, and we talked about the sort of development of the monastery, right? So one of the things that's very similar to a atrium, which was the entrance to the church, is this notion of a cloister. And a cloister was a part of the monastery that was only where the monks would be. So the laity would not be allowed into the cloister. So it was a private area for contemplation. It was usually adjacent to the dormitories where they might sort of have residence or sleep. One of the things that we've talked about it a little bit is this notion of a pier or a composite pier. So a column is a singular element, right, that kind of has a set sort of size. When the structure and the loads get so heavy that a column can't accommodate that, we end up with a pier. When we look at Romanesque architecture, one of the things that we're going to find is that oftentimes you'll see a pier and then maybe two smaller arches with a column in the middle and then another pier. So, and sometimes there'll be two columns between two piers and three arches. So it just sort of varies depending on, when it was developed. I'm already at 14 minutes, so I'm going to stop this and finish off this lecture in the next video.